The first thing I like to do is to actually draw your attention to the title of this event, which is How to Get Rid of the Billionaires. We didn't title it Why You Should Get Rid of the Billionaires, which might seem a more logical place to start. The reason we didn't go with that title is because, in a sense, it would be redundant. And what do I mean by that? That I think if you talk to people out there, and especially young people, about how they view society, I think most people have already posed that question, why, and answered that question for themselves, right? That it doesn't take a genius to look at the world today and see homelessness, see 15% unemployment in Canada, see a total absence of housing and a total failure to build housing in this country, on the one hand, and on the other hand, look at Bay Street, an incredible concentration of wealth, yachts piling on top of yachts on the other hand. Well, the country's falling apart. It doesn't take a genius to look at that and to be angry about that. People learn those lessons from life. And that's the thing. You don't need to come to a Marxist event or read a Marxist book to draw the conclusion that the way our world works, there's something wrong with it. And so people have formed those conclusions for themselves. In fact, I would say that if you look at society, if you look at the polls, I would say actually that one of the defining features of the world we live in today is a generalized distrust, you could say, in all of the institutions of capitalism. A total lack of trust in politicians, a total lack of trust in corporations, a total lack of trust in the courts, and you can continue going down the list. And I would say that's true of people who consider themselves traditionally left-wing, but it's increasingly true of many people who consider themselves right-wing. You even have a figure like Pierre Poilievre coming out in the last election campaign, one of his main slogans being that we need to fight against a society of the have-yachts and the have-nots. Now, of course, we're not supporters of Pierre Poilievre here. He's an opportunist and he's a liar. But this shows you the mood in society, the generalized mood in society. And I think sometimes we don't fully appreciate the implications of this mood and just how big a shift has taken place in consciousness in the last period. You have people always saying, attitudes don't change. We can't have a revolution because attitudes don't change. Well, I would beg to differ. In fact, if you look at the last few decades, I would say that you've seen a profound transformation in consciousness over the last few decades. If you go back to the 1990s, for example, now I don't know if many of the people here were alive during the 1990s. I was alive for a bit, near the tail end. I don't have a living memory of the 1990s. But I know some people who were alive during that period. In fact, I know some Marxists who were alive and doing work in the 1990s. And let me just say, it was a very difficult time to be a Marxist in the 1990s. Not only did you not have interest, you'd be lucky if someone didn't spit at you, right? Or threaten to assault you. That did happen in the 1990s. But I'll set the scene for you. 1991, you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, a total lack of or demoralization in the idea that communism was a way forward. You had a massive bolstering of the so-called free market capitalist system. You had a very popular book at the time by an author by the name of Francis Fukuyama. The book was titled The End of History, which put forward the idea that Western liberal democracy essentially represented the pinnacle of human achievement, that we could do no better. And you had a generalized trust, you could say, in the institutions of society amongst a very wide layer. That was the mood in the 90s. Fast forward a bit, 2008. You have the collapse of Lehman Brothers in the United States. You have the meltdown of the American and then the world financial system. This leads to the collapse of the world economy. Millions of people lost their jobs. Millions of people lost their homes. Suicide rates shot up. Drug rate usages shot up. Everything bad you could possibly imagine shot up. But what happened to the bankers, who were universally held responsible for what took place in 2008? Not a single one of them went to jail. Very few of them met with any serious repercussions whatsoever. In fact, just the opposite happened. You know, they'd been talking for years and years about the invisible hand of the market, the free market. The state should have no role in directing the economy. But what was the first thing they did in 2008? They went knocking on the government's door, asked for bailouts, and then they were bailed out to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars in our money, in taxpayer money. You know, there was a slogan going around at the time that people used to say, you know, what we have are privatized profits, but socialized losses. And a lot of people saw things that way. And what you had in 2008 was a comeuppance, if you like, that people saw, again, capitalism for what it was. It wasn't wealth creators, geniuses. You know, it wasn't the end of human history, I'll tell you that. They saw it for what it was, which was a big frickin' scam, to be honest. That's what it was. Profits when times are good, and when times are bad, the taxpayer bails them out. That's what people saw. And this led to a very profound shift in consciousness since that time. Just to illustrate, I have a few polls here. Again, in the 1990s, you could say you had an almost universal level of trust in capitalism, the free market system. But according to, this is a poll from Gallup, by 2010, trust in capitalism had declined to 61%. By 2025, which is this year, it had fallen again to 54%. That's in the heart of capitalism. That's in the United States, people saying that. In the same period, you saw an uptick in the support for socialism. But I would say what's most profound is the shift in attitude of the youth. There was a poll that came out just the other day from the Cato Institute, which is, the question was, do you have a favorable or an unfavorable view of communism? Between those aged 18 to 29, 34% said they had a favorable view of communism. That was in the United States of America. Again, the heart of American capitalism. But then if we move beyond capitalism, socialism, and we look at attitudes towards big business, then the numbers are even more stark. Again, I'm going back to the Gallup poll. In 2010, the trust in big business stood at 49% in the United States. By 2025, that had collapsed to 37%. We see a similar thing in Canada. This is the Edelman Trust Barometer. This is from this year. Trust in business leaders. In 2021, the question was, do you think business leaders purposely mislead people? In 2021, 50% of Canadians said they mislead people. 4 years later, this year, 66% say big business misleads people. Again, from the Edelman Trust Barometer, 73% of Canadians say the wealthy don't pay their fair share of taxes. 61% say the wealthy's selfishness causes many of our problems. That's in Canada. But I would say the most revealing thing is the response we've seen to Luigi Mangione, which I think has had the effect of revealing all of the pent-up anger that exists in the United States and in Canada. And there was a poll done, this one's from YouGov, which was asking people their views, if they have a favorable or an unfavorable view of Luigi Mangione. For the general population, so all US adult citizens, 21% had a favorable view of Luigi Mangione. 37% said they don't know. What's also interesting is they looked at specifically conservatives. Conservatives, 15% had a favorable view of Luigi Mangione. 15% of conservatives. 29% don't know. But then the most stark is, again, the youth. those aged 18 to 29, 39% had a favorable view of Luigi Mangione, 32% didn't know, and only 29% of American youth have an unfavorable view of Luigi Mangione. This gives you an idea of the mood that exists in the US today. In fact, I was reading the other day that they actually created a musical. I don't know if you heard about this. Luigi the Musical. And it instantly sold out. And they're adding new stops on the tour now because it was so popular. So this gives you an idea of the mood. And I would say that this mood, they talk about, again, how young people come to universities and they get indoctrinated. That's why they have these dangerous ideas about socialism and communism and so on. But again, this mood has not come out of thin air, but is based on the real lived experience of working class families all across the world. That I mentioned 2008. But since 2008, the situation has become far, far worse for the overwhelming majority of working class Canadians. Wealth inequality has become worse. There's a figure of this year from the Canadian Centre of Policy Alternatives, which revealed that the top paid CEOs in Canada make 210 times what the average worker in Canada makes, which is up from 189 in 2010. And I would pose the question, because there's this idea that, well, they earn that because they work harder and they're smarter. But I'll pose the question, does the average CEO work 210 times harder than the average Canadian worker? Are they 210 times more intelligent than the average Canadian worker? Well, if you want, go ask a person on the street what they think about that. And I think you'll get a very fitting answer. It's a load of crap. It's a complete load of crap, this whole idea that they should make this much money. In fact, not only have they not worked for it, many of them have inherited that money. If you look at the top 10 richest billionaires in Canada, 5 of them are members of the same family. That's the Thompson family. Each one of them inherited their wealth. 5 people on that list. The richest man on that list, which is a guy by the name of Changpeng Zhao, I hadn't even heard of him. He's the CEO of a cryptocurrency exchange called Binance. He was just sentenced to 4 months in prison in the United States for fraud. And he's now demanding a pardon from Donald Trump. That's the richest man in Canada. So forgive people for thinking, that they don't work hard. Because what people see, it's not a bunch of people who are working hard. It's a bunch of trust fund babies and criminals. And they're right to see it that way. They're entirely correct to see it that way. So these are the people who are leading our society. I've got more figures, but I don't have time to go into them. But all of that aside, I would say it's not just the wealth inequality. I think people can accept a certain level of wealth inequality if the economy is growing, if they're creating jobs, if they're building homes, and so on and so forth. But that's not happening. Marx made a very interesting point in the Communist Manifesto, which, if you haven't read that book, I'd recommend. It's a very modern text in a lot of ways. But you might be a bit struck the first time you read the Communist Manifesto, because it begins with a glowing review, you could say, of capitalism. Marx speaks of it in a positive sense. And he talks about the role that capitalism played in developing industry and so on and so forth. That was the role that capitalism played historically. But Marx made the point that a system can play a progressive role insofar as it develops the productive forces in society. And what that means is science, technology, production, etc., etc. But when it ceases to play that role, then we enter the period of revolutions. That's what Marx had to say. Now we have to look at capitalism today. Is it playing that same role that Marx described in the Communist Manifesto? And I think we would have to give a resounding no to that question. And again, you don't have to trust us, but again, ask people out there. fact, there was a poll done. This was just also this year, I think, from the Pew Research Center. And this was looking at the people who say that when children in their country grow up, they will be financially better than their parents. In other words, they're asking people if they feel that way, will your kids be better off? 78% of Canadians say their children will be worse off. 78% of Canadians say that, which is one of the worst rates in the world, I would add. Only 16% say their children will be better off. That doesn't seem like a vote of confidence, in my opinion. And again, you don't have to look at the polls. You can just look out your window. Look at the opioid crisis. Look at the homelessness. Look at the lack of homes. Look at the youth unemployment. That's what capitalism means in Canada in 2025. It's not delivering the goods, and it's a frickin' scam. This is how people see it, and I think they're correct to see it that way. Now, what do we do about it? Because I don't think this is a revelation to most people. The question is, what do we do to change this society? How do we get rid of the billionaires? That's the million-dollar, or maybe the billion-dollar question here. How do we actually get rid of these people? How do we actually change this system? Now, obviously, as a Marxist organization, we have a few ideas about that. But I would say this. I would say that we have to have a sense of proportion. Marxism still represents a very, very small current in society. Yes, there's lots of people who identify as communist, but it still represents a small current in society. And so what's happened is that in the absence of a real explanation, you've had a number of other ideas which have come forward to effectively fill the vacuum, if you like. And a number of figures who have come up, and you could say essentially encapsulated the anger that exists in society. And I want to focus on two of them, which, if you like, both represent two different sets of ideas, if you like, of how to get rid of the billionaires. And those figures are Luigi Mangione and Zohran Mamdani. And I want to explore them a little bit. The first thing I would say is that the level of support for these two individuals, in general, represents a positive development. Because again, what they represent at the end of the day is a reflection of the anger that exists in society, in the United States and in Canada. So in that sense, we celebrate these developments. But that's not enough. We also got to take a sober view of what they're proposing, what they represent, and a scientific view and ask, do they work? And if these methods don't work, it's beholden on us to provide other answers for what to do. So what do we see here? Now let me start with my boy Luigi, who's also Italian, like me. Best thing to happen to the Italian community since, I don't know, Pavarotti? He was Italian, right? Anyway, very popular with my family too, I would add. But let me say this. The most notable thing about Luigi and this whole situation with the assassination of this CEO is the incredible hypocrisy of the ruling class in relation to Luigi. That I can't tell you how many articles I've read condemning Luigi Mangione and, moral outrage about what Luigi Mangione did. But there's some hypocrisy at play here. Because let me just go through a few figures. On the U.S. healthcare system and the insurance system in the United States, every year, 45,000 Americans die because they lack access to health insurance in the United States. 500,000 people every year are driven into bankruptcy because they can't pay their medical bills. And you also have millions of claims denied every year for people who do have health insurance and pay a lot of money for that health insurance. And then the claims are denied for all kinds of spurious reasons. Tens of thousands of lives destroyed and families driven to ruin. And let me pose a question. Where's the moral outrage of the press and the politicians about these people? You never hear it. You never hear it. Right? Because these are people who are, yeah, they're not maybe being shot in the head by a gun. But it's murder just the same. You know, I was listening to, I don't know if people know Bill Burr. He's a comedian. One of my favorite comedians. He came under attack recently because he defended Luigi. He actually celebrated the killing of the CEO. But he made an interesting point on his podcast the other day. You know what he said? He said, well, listen, yeah, he committed murder, so they say. But what these people do, the health insurance CEOs, is also a kind of murder. He said it's the legal side of murder. I think that's a good way of putting it. But that's exactly what it is. Because it's the decisions of these companies that result in the deaths of tens of thousands of people every year in the United States. So I can't say I shed a tear for Brian Thompson. Sorry to say. But that's not the question. Because for Marxists, when it comes to these questions, it's not just a moral question. We have to ask, okay, but does this work? Is this actually going to change things in the United States? And I think we have to answer, no. It's not going to fundamentally change things. One CEO gets replaced by another CEO, and that company has continued to act in the same way, fundamentally, as it did before. That you can kill a CEO, but that's not the same as overthrowing the system. And we're seeing that play out now. I would just add that there's a historical precedent for this, historical examples. And I'll just use one. Actually, you have to go back to the 1880s in Russia. But at that time, and this was before the rise of Russian Marxism, you had a group by the name of Narodnoya Volya. I'm sorry for my Russian pronunciation if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But this was a revolutionary group. It was a group that was opposed to the monarchy in Russia, and it was a left-wing group. But that group had this idea that, listen, the masses aren't moving. And what we need is an extreme action to effectively wake the masses up and get them going. It's something you hear a lot today too, I would add. This whole idea that, you know, history is moving too slow. And we need to do some big action to give history a little push. And for them that meant, you know, bombing police stations. It meant killing state officials, and so on and so forth. If you put it another way, it was an extreme form of direct action, is what that group represented. And not only that, they were incredibly successful. In fact, I would say that the Narodnoya Volya was the most successful left-wing terrorist group in history. Why? Because they actually achieved their aim. They killed the monarch of Russia. In 1881, I think they threw a couple of bombs at his carriage. And they blew him to kingdom come. But what was the result of that killing? What was the result of that killing? Did it lead to a revolution in Russia? No. Did it lead to reforms being granted in Russia? No. In fact, just the opposite happened. One czar was replaced by an even more brutal czar. It introduced a huge period of repression against the wider movement, and that group was effectively wiped off, never to return again. Actually, you see a similar thing playing out with this Kirk murder, which happened just a few days ago. Now, we don't have all of the details about what exactly the motives of this guy were. Other than that, he was extremely online. I needed help, honestly, from some of the younger comrades to decrypt some of these messages, you know, the bulge and the owo, and I don't know. Strange guy. Regardless, what will be the consequences of this action? The consequences of this action, we have to be honest, will be reactionary. MAGA will be massively emboldened and unified. Because remember, the MAGA movement just a few months ago was beginning slowly to divide over the question actually of Jeffrey Epstein, because Trump was refusing to release the files. Actually, also on the question of Israel. You saw this with Tucker Carlson coming out, and he took a different view on U.S. support for Israel. Because of this attack, all of that will be cut across in the next period, and it will have a massive unifying effect on the MAGA movement. It will also be used as a pretext to crack down on the left. And you got a hint of this when Trump made his address a few days ago, where he essentially said, we're going to use this to crack down on the left. So these will be the consequences of this. I would say that the problem with this approach in general, and not just with this, but this idea of direct action, of, we need to speed up history. It has one chief defect, in my opinion, is that it tries to replace the independent movement of the working class with the heroic acts of individuals. This is essentially the problem with this idea. And you can't transform the system this way. It also teaches people the wrong lesson, I would say. It teaches working people the wrong lesson. That, listen, you don't got to do anything. I'll do it for you. I'll kill them. I'll blow up the building. And then you can follow after me. This whole idea that the masses need to be woken up. In fact, it achieves the opposite, It puts the masses to sleep, these kinds of actions. And it doesn't promote the independent movement of the working class as a class. So this is why we oppose that tactic. But moving on, because I think that's clear enough. Actually, no, one more thing on this idea about direct action. Because obviously Luigi is a very popular figure. But I would say that it's a minority of people who have come to the conclusion that, okay, now I need to do what Luigi did. I've heard it. I have heard it. I don't know if they're actually going to do it. I'll let you know if they do it. But I wouldn't say that's the opinion of most people. In fact, actually, this comes to a broader question, which is the question of consciousness. There's this idea that consciousness for Marxists, that we view it as an inherently revolutionary thing. And in fact, that's not true. We don't view consciousness as an inherently revolutionary thing. In fact, the way we view consciousness is in fact as an inherently conservative thing. And what do I mean by that? That people don't want to rock the boat unless they absolutely have to. I would say that's true of most people in this society. That in other words, when people get pushed into action, the first thing they grab for is not the people standing on the extreme left. It's not a group like ours, but it's the people who come forward promising gradual change. Listen, we can make the changes without going to these extremes. We don't need a revolution. We can change the system from within the system. These are the figures that gain precedence. And this brings us to the question of Zohran Mamdani, who I would say is an expression of this development. Now, two things I will say, first of all, about what the popularity of Zohran Mamdani reveals, because I think there are lessons here. First of all, again, like with Luigi, you see with Zohran the absolute hypocrisy of the ruling class. You've had endless attacks against Mamdani and his program. Trump called him a 100% communist lunatic shortly after he won the primary. And why are they saying these things? Because he supports a program of mild reforms. Mild, and they are mild reforms. If you compare Mamdani's program with any run-of-the-mill, your old-school European Social Democratic Party, it's not a particularly radical program. But all of the press is losing their minds. All of them. They've also attacked him on the question of Palestine, because he's expressed support for the Palestinian people. I don't know if you saw this one debate when he was still competing, but they had all of the mayors, all the candidates, I should say, up on the podium, and they asked them the question, where's the first place you'll visit after being elected mayor of New York City? And they went all down the line. Mamdani was last. First one, Israel. Of course. The next one, well, I would go to Israel. The third one, well, I think I would go to Israel. The fourth one, Israel. And then it came to Mamdani, and he gave a very good answer. He said, I would stay in New York City to address the problems of New Yorkers. And they viciously attacked him for saying that. It shows how idiotic these people are. We got to be, they are idiots, these people, when they make statements like that. Also, who's Mamdani running against? He's running against Eric Adams and Andrew Cuomo, one who's credibly accused of corruption while he was mayor of New York City, and the other who's credibly accused of sexual harassment. But no, Mamdani's the problem. Mamdani needs to be solved. Mamdani's evil. It's really ridiculous, the hypocrisy that we see coming from these people. But I would say it also reveals something more important, is that socialist ideas can be popular in the heart of U.S. capitalism. And I'd ask you to think about this. It's New York City. It's New York City. New York City alone has 123 billionaires. It actually has more billionaires than any other city in the world. New York City's metro has a GDP that's so large that if it was a country, it'd be one of the largest 10 countries in the world. So this is very important from the perspective of U.S. capitalism. The fact that Mamdani can gain support in a place like that shows you the level of anger that exists in the United States, and I would say in Canada as well. So this is the first thing I would say. We take this as Marxists, we take this seriously and enthusiastically. I think it's a positive development. But again, we have to pose the question, is what Mamdani proposing actually going to work? And I would say there's a number of shortcomings in front of Mamdani. The first obstacle is he's running on the Democratic ticket. Now, what is the Democratic Party in the United States? The Democratic Party is not just a party of billionaires. It is the main party of the billionaires in the United States. And not only that, it has a long history of suppressing left-wing candidates. And if you want proof of that, you can just go back a few years ago with Bernie Sanders, where they sabotaged his campaign, not once but twice, because they could not accept a figure like Bernie Sanders becoming the leader of the Democratic Party. You know, there's an old saying about the Democrats, which is that the Democratic Party is the graveyard of social movements. And you saw that in practice with Bernie Sanders. Also, I mentioned these attacks which have been happening against Mamdani, but I'll say the most feverish attacks have not been coming from the Republicans. It's been coming from within the Democratic Party, the establishment Democrats, figures like Chuck Schumer, Hakeem Jeffries, and so on and so forth. So this presents, I would say, a major, major obstacle against Mamdani. But let's put that to one side. Let's say he still gets elected, and they're going to try to prevent it. And the Democratic establishment is going to try to prevent it. But let's also say he still gets elected. Now, Mamdani is proposing a number of reforms which, as Marxists, we support. They're actually very good reforms. He's called for a $30 minimum wage, which I think is a very good demand. He's called for free and fast buses in New York City. He's called for free and universal childcare in New York City, and a number of other things. How he proposes to pay for this is by raising the corporate tax rate to make it on par with, I think, New Jersey, the New York State tax rate, and adding a new tax on wealth in excess of $1 million. But there's a few problems here. The first problem, and I actually didn't realize this at first, the mayor of New York City does not have the power to do any of this at all. In New York State, the authority for raising taxes rests with the governor of the state. They're the only one that can raise taxes in the state of New York. And the governor of New York, who, by the way, is a Democrat, has already come out against Mamdani and said, I'm not going to introduce any of this. They've already said that, and he hasn't even been elected yet. You also have problems in other areas. Free buses. Well, that's a decision that rests with the MTA, with the New York Transit Authority, which the mayor of New York does not have direct control over. So we'll also be having a fight with the city bureaucracy of New York in the next period. In fact, the only area where the mayor has significant power over is the police. And he's already began to moderate on this question. I don't know if you saw the New York Times article from a few days ago, but Mamdani said he's now going to issue an apology to the New York City Police Department for calling them racist. Back in, 2020, I think he made that comment. So already you can say he's moderating somewhat on this question. Now, If Mamdani were to say, listen, if you don't implement these reforms, if you don't make these changes, I'm going to bring millions of people into the streets. I'm going to call on workers to occupy their factories. I'm going to call on workers to go on strike until you meet the demands of the people of New York City. Then maybe he could get somewhere. Oh, and by the way, you know what would be really useful for mobilizing millions of people in New York City? Would be your own party, which he does not have. And from the very beginning, he's going to be hogtied by the Democratic Party. And as far as I'm aware, Mamdani has not talked about building this kind of movement to force the governor to act. So we have some very, very serious obstacles here. Put that aside. Let's say he does it anyway. Let's say the governor gives in to the demands, makes the changes. But then we still have another problem here. And the problem is this. You can't control what you don't own. What do I mean by that? That in capitalism, all of the important decisions are not made by elected officials. They're made by CEOs and bankers in boardrooms. And if the CEOs aren't happy with the government that gets elected, what they will do is use everything in their power, capital strike, shutting down factories, the courts, the police, so on and so forth, everything in their power in order to sabotage that government, stop the reforms from being introduced, and forcing the government to back off. And we have a long history of this, which I don't have the time to go into. But the point is that insofar as they have the economic power, there's a limit to what kind of reforms you can achieve. Actually, just to illustrate, look at what's happening to Trump. Now, Trump is obviously a reactionary. We don't support Trump in any way, shape, or form. But also, you could say that Trump is not entirely trusted by the dominant wing of the ruling class in the United States. Not because he's not an enemy of the workers, he is, but because they can't, he's a bit unpredictable, I guess you could say. Now look at what they've done to him, the deep state, as he calls it. All of the court cases they've used against him, and so on and so forth. If a Mamdani or a Sanders were to become president of the United States, you would see the same form of sabotage and pressure multiplied 100 times. That would be the situation. So it doesn't matter how the American people vote, because at the end of the day, it's the CEOs who have the power in the United States. All of this to say, this is why Marxists are critical, you could say, of reformism. And it's not a moral question. It's a purely tactical question. Will these reforms actually work? And I'd be the first to say, if it were possible to reform our way out of capitalism, if it were really possible, I'd be the first to leave this organization and sign up for Zohran Mamdani's campaign tomorrow, if that were possible. Why? Because it's far easier to do it that way than to years and years building a revolutionary party. It's a lot of work. I got other things to do. I got other things to do. But the problem is that, in my opinion, it does not work. And in fact, it's not the idea of revolution that's utopian. It's the idea of reforming our way out of capitalism, reforming our way, reforming the billionaires away, which is a completely utopian idea. And I say this, that there's a lot of differences between a figure like Luigi Mangione and Zohran Mamdani, but there's also certain things that they have in common. And I would say the defining feature that both of these individuals have in common is this. You could say an impatience or a lack of faith in the working class and in the working class's ability to take control and run society for themselves. I think this is common to both of them. Again, history is moving too slow. We need to act now. There's an old saying about, I mentioned this Russian terrorist group, but there was an old saying of the Russian Marxists when they were describing these terrorist groups. They said, a terrorist is a liberal with a bomb. And that's truly what it was, because it stemmed from the same idea that we cannot wait for the working class, that the working class cannot make the change themselves. And I would say that this is the main feature which delineates Marxism from these other ideas. That where Marxism begins, you could say, is with the faith in the working class. And when I say faith, I don't mean a religious faith. You know, it's not because Marx said it in 1848, so now we have to believe it. But a faith that's rooted in science, through a study of history, a study of economics, and a study of the movement of the working class. That's how we reach those conclusions. Now, I've already run out of time, so I'm not going to go into a full exposition of what Marxism is. We'll take that up in the discussion, I'm sure. But I'll just say this. First of all, in a nutshell, we believe in a society where the working class seizes the big banks, seizes the big factories, seizes the big shops, takes them into public ownership, and runs them democratically, not on the basis of profit, but on the basis of human need. We think that in order to do that, you need a revolution. There's no way around it. You need a revolution. And when we say revolution, we don't mean let's all arm ourselves after this meeting and go kill as many Bay Street CEOs as we possibly can. I think actually Trotsky gave one of the best definitions of revolution, and he described it in this way. He said, what a revolution is the direct interference of the working class into history. Working class people governing for themselves. You know, because you think in most normal times, politics is not something we do. Politics is something done to us by men in suits on Bay Street and in Ottawa. What a revolution is the masses saying, no, we're done with that. Now we make the decisions. And the major question is this possible? And to that question, I'll just say this. Not only is revolution possible, it's happening. It's happening right now. In Indonesia, in Nepal, move back a few years, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, move back a few years, Egypt, Tunisia, so on and so forth. We could spend the rest of this night listing the number of revolutions that have happened over the last few decades. Revolutions are happening everywhere. And it's honestly quite remarkable. I'd encourage you, if you haven't seen the scenes of Nepal, if you haven't seen the scenes in Indonesia, go home after this event and watch them and see what people are capable of when push comes to shove. You know, I'm obsessed with this one video in Nepal where they found the home of the finance minister. They raided his home, chased him out, chased him through the streets. There was one excellent video where the finance minister was running, and from out of nowhere, it's almost as though this young man just comes flying from the side of the screen doing like a Bruce Lee style kick and knocks him, and it looks like he goes flying, this finance minister, kicks him into a wall, continues chasing him. Eventually they reach a river. They push him into the river. They put a helmet on his head and then knock his head with the helmet. They didn't kill him, I don't think. It's actually very interesting the way the youth in Nepal are conducting the revolution. They don't kill their politicians. They beat them up like they're cartoon characters. It's a very interesting way of conducting a revolution. And I would say rightfully so, because for years these people have been stealing from the Nepalese people. They've been bankrupting families in Nepal. And so they have entirely every reason to feel an incredible sense of anger towards these people. So revolutions are happening. And they're not happening because people came to a meeting like this or read a book on Marxism. In fact, it's not Marxists at all that make revolutions. In fact, it's capitalism that makes revolutions. Or I should say, it's the conditions that capitalism forces people into that forces them onto the road of revolution. And that's what we're seeing happen in country after country. But it's not enough to have a revolution. You also need a revolutionary leadership. Because if we take any lesson from the history of revolutions, that it's not possible to create a genuine militant leadership on the spot, spontaneously in the heat of revolution, but that you must invest the time building up a significant force in the years before a revolution breaks out. And there's lots of analogies you could use, but I'll just use one, which is the firefighter analogy. You know, if you want to put out a fire, if you're a firefighter, the first thing you need is water. You need a hose with an incredible pressure that's capable of producing large amounts of water towards the fire. That pressure, to use this analogy, is like the force of the masses. millions of people. Without that, you could have the greatest leaders in the world. You're not going to be able to put out that fire. But it's not enough just to have the hose. I don't know if you've ever seen a firefighter's hose when it's not being held by the firefighter. But it goes like this. It goes in all directions. You wouldn't be very effective at putting out a fire that way. There needs to be a firefighter who's able to channel that pressure at the correct source, in the correct direction, in order to achieve the task. A revolutionary party, I would say, functions in a very similar way. It doesn't create the anger. It doesn't create the revolution. But what it does is it helps direct it at the point of attack. And I would say that has never been more necessary. And I hope if you agree with some of these ideas and you haven't already joined, that you consider joining us in this task. Because if we look at the world today, we're speaking about fire. The world is on fire. Wars, a genocide in Gaza, civil wars in country after country, poverty, starvation, homelessness, opioid crisis, and you can go down the list. And in fact, the world is literally on fire. If we look at the question of the climate crisis, it's literally on fire. That is what capitalism means for the world today. And if it's allowed to continue, it will destroy humanity. I'm firmly of that opinion. It will destroy humanity if it's not extinguished in a reasonable amount of time. Now, just to end, I don't know if anyone here is a fan of Billy Joel. I'm a big fan of Billy Joel. But he had a song. You maybe heard it. We Didn't Start the Fire. You know that song? We Didn't Start the Fire. Interesting story behind that song. How he came up with that song. He was in the recording studio with Sean Lennon, who was the son of John Lennon. And he was going on, Sean was, about how in the 80s, it's really hard being a young kid in the 1980s. And Billy Joel said, well, yeah, it was really hard being a kid in my time, too. There was a lot going on back then. And Sean was kind of dismissive, and he said, everyone knows that nothing happened in the post-war period. What are you talking about? And so Billy Joel wrote this song, We Didn't Start the Fire, which is literally, if you've listened to it, it's just a list of essentially everything that happened while Billy Joel was alive, just listing them out. That's the whole song, just listing out all of the things that happened. And yeah, we didn't start the fire. But there's one problem with that song, I would say, is that he never actually says who started the fire in the song. This is the problem with it. We know who started the fire. And if we get organized, then we can help to put it out. So I'll leave it there.